The Empire had always prided itself on its military might. From its vast starships to its armored legions, everything about its forces screamed dominance. When the Imperial fleet moved across the galaxy, it was an announcement of power, a statement that none could ignore. The soldiers, towering in their uniformed splendor, were designed to instill fear, each one a symbol of absolute control. Their presence was enough to crush resistance, their sheer numbers and firepower a testament to the glory of the Empire. And in this world of visible strength and authority, the Empire believed they understood the fundamental truth of warfare. Victory came from intimidation, from the enemy's recognition of the inevitable. But then came Earth. The first encounter, brief though it was, should have been nothing more than a footnote in the Empire's long history of conquests. A minor skirmish, one that involved little more than a handful of soldiers and a strategically insignificant target. The Empire sent their finest troops, fully armed, their gleaming armor reflecting the distant light of a dying star. They landed on Earth with all the pomp and circumstance that their traditions demanded. The soldiers disembarked from their ships, each one a monument to the Empire's might, their presence a declaration that they were here to take what they wanted. But Earth's response was peculiar. The soldiers they encountered were far from imposing. They appeared as ordinary people, dressed in plain clothes, moving through the streets with no hint of military formality. There was no show of strength, no overt display of power. The Empire's commander scoffed, assuming that the humans were weak, their military forces no match for the Empire's supremacy. After all, how could a planet so unremarkable in appearance produce anything that could stand against the mighty Empire? One of the Empire's generals, a veteran of countless battles, watched the Earth soldiers from a distance. They were scattered in small groups, mingling with civilians in a way that struck him as odd. They didn't stand apart. They didn't march in unison or strike imposing poses. They just blended in. A few humans here and there, seemingly insignificant in their everyday attire. To the general, this was nothing more than a strange form of submission. Earth, it seemed, had surrendered without a fight. The battle that followed was quick. Too quick. The Empire's soldiers advanced with the kind of reckless confidence that comes with years of dominance. They expected Earth's soldiers to cower, to falter. But Earth's forces were not where they had been expected to be. Instead, they came from unexpected places, hidden within the very crowds that the Empire had considered harmless. What had seemed like civilian bystanders turned out to be soldiers, fully trained, fully prepared. The Empire's forces were taken by surprise, too slow, too unprepared to face the guerrilla tactics that Earth had mastered. The general's frustration was palpable. His forces, despite their superior numbers, found themselves outmaneuvered at every turn. Earth's soldiers, though vastly fewer in number, seemed to know the landscape better, striking with precision and vanishing just as quickly. The Empire's military might, so carefully crafted over centuries, was nothing against this new kind of warfare, a warfare that relied on subtlety and surprise rather than overwhelming force. As the days passed, the situation only grew more dire for the Empire. Their forces found themselves bogged down in endless skirmishes, unable to locate the enemy in the labyrinth of Earth's urban environments. The soldiers who had appeared so unremarkable now revealed their true nature. They were not mere civilians, but highly trained operatives who knew how to turn the very environment against their invaders. The general, now deeply unsettled, sought answers. Why had Earth soldiers not come out in force, like any other military? Were their uniforms? Were the grand displays of power? It was as though the humans had somehow turned the very concept of military warfare on its head, choosing to make themselves invisible rather than visible. And in this invisibility, they had found an edge that the Empire had never anticipated. A meeting was convened aboard one of the Empire's flagship vessels, the central hub of their operations on Earth. The general stood before his commanders, his posture rigid, but his mind clearly racing. "How is it," he began, his voice tinged with frustration, "that a species with no discernible military structure has managed to best us in this manner?" One of the commanders, a tactical strategist known for his sharp intellect, stepped forward. "We underestimated them," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Earth soldiers do not rely on the same tactics we are used to. They've embraced something we've never truly understood: the power of discretion." Discretion? The word felt alien to the general. He had been trained in the old ways, the ways that emphasized visibility, power, and intimidation. Discretion was something you used when you were trying to avoid a fight, not when you were seeking to win it. "They blend in," the strategist continued, "and that is what makes them so dangerous. By looking like civilians, they lower our guard. They use the environment to their advantage, striking from unexpected places and then disappearing just as quickly. Their strength lies not in numbers or weaponry, but in their ability to remain undetected until it's too late." The general's mind raced as he processed this. The more he thought about it, the more it became clear Earth soldiers had perfected a form of psychological warfare. They had made themselves indistinguishable from ordinary people, drawing the Empire into a false sense of security. In doing so, they had made the first strike invisible, and the Empire's military machine had been forced to play catch-up. "It's a strategy," the general muttered to himself, "one that turns our own arrogance against us. We thought we were the only ones who understood the art of war. But these humans, they found a way to fight without ever showing their hand." The realization was both sobering and terrifying. The Empire's soldiers, accustomed to crushing their foes with sheer force, now found themselves in a battle of wits. This wasn't a war of armies. It was a war of ideas. And in this new kind of battle, the Empire was on the back foot. As the general prepared to leave the meeting, a thought lingered in his mind. Earth soldiers had been underestimated not because they were weak, but because they had chosen not to flaunt their power. In their humility, they had created a weapon more dangerous than any gun or ship: the weapon of invisibility. The Empire had learned the hard way that sometimes strength was best hidden, not displayed. But the general knew one thing for certain: the Empire would not make the same mistake again. The Empire, humbled by its earlier failure, began to rethink its approach to Earth. General Kalen, a man whose reputation had been built on decisiveness and strength, now found himself questioning everything he had once known about warfare. He had returned to the capital in disgrace, his once immense confidence shattered by Earth's unexpected resilience. It was one thing to be defeated by an enemy. It was another to be outwitted by one that didn't even seem to be trying. The Imperial High Command convened again, with Kalen at the center of a discussion that felt both urgent and oddly humbling. The previous strategies had failed. The overwhelming force, the sheer presence of their troops, none of it had worked against Earth soldiers. It was clear now that Earth wasn't just fighting a traditional war. They were waging a different kind of conflict, one based not on strength, but on knowledge, stealth, and unpredictability. They understood that the most dangerous enemy was the one who knew how to remain unseen until it was too late. Admiral Sira, an imposing figure who had always maintained a pragmatic view of the galaxy's various conflicts, now took the floor. "We've been fighting them all wrong," she said, her voice sharp as a blade. "We thought Earth was weak because they didn't showcase their might. We didn't understand that the real weapon is in what they don't show us. We underestimated their strategy, and we paid for it." Kalen listened intently, his brow furrowed in thought. He had never been one to question authority, but there was something in Admiral Sira's words that struck him deeply. He had always believed in the weight of power, in the crushing inevitability of an army that made its presence known. Yet here was Earth, proving that power didn't always need to be on display. Sometimes, true strength came from restraint. "We need to adapt," Admiral Sira continued, pacing back and forth. "Earth doesn't follow our rules. They've created their own, and we've been too slow to recognize it. It's time we do what they've done, become invisible." She paused, letting the words settle in. "We need to learn how to fight their way." Kalen stood motionless for a moment, contemplating the proposal. The idea of blending into the surroundings, of masking the strength that the Empire had always prided itself on, felt foreign to him. He was a soldier, raised on the principles of overwhelming force, of making a statement with every move. To think like Earth soldiers, to fight as they did, it would require him to rethink everything he had ever known about war. But Kalen was no fool. He had seen what Earth soldiers were capable of. They had made a mockery of the Empire's entire military doctrine, and if the Empire was to regain control, it would have to learn to adapt. He spoke, his voice low but resolute. We'll have to train our forces. We'll have to move in silence in the shadows. If Earth can remain undetected until the moment they strike, then so can we. The plan was set into motion swiftly. The Empire would not simply send its troops back to Earth. They would first undergo a rigorous training program designed to teach them Earth's brand of warfare. The first step was to strip away everything that made them recognizable as soldiers. Their uniforms, their shining armor, even the insignia that denoted rank, all would be gone. They would be taught to blend in, to move unnoticed, to become just another face in the crowd. For Kalen, this meant working closely with a new breed of instructors, soldiers who had defected from the Empire's elite ranks and now operated under the radar, far from the reach of Imperial command. These were the veterans who had learned the art of blending in, who had once been part of the Empire's might and now lived in the shadows, utilizing the same tactics Earth soldiers had perfected. The training was grueling, far different from the rigid structure Kalen was used to. Instead of marching in formation or practicing drills, the soldiers were taught to think on their feet, to adapt in real time. They learned how to use the environment to their advantage, how to disappear into crowds, and how to strike from the most unexpected angles. There were no flashy displays of power here, only subtle movements, quiet commands, and the careful cultivation of patience. The first test of this new strategy came when the Empire dispatched a small squad to a rural Earth settlement. It was a practice mission meant to gauge the effectiveness of their new training. The soldiers, now stripped of their traditional uniforms and armed only with basic weapons, were tasked with infiltrating the settlement without being noticed. They were not to engage unless absolutely necessary, and the mission was to be completed with as little disruption as possible. Kalen watched from a distance, his heart pounding in his chest. The soldiers, once so accustomed to charging into battle with their heads held high, now moved like phantoms, their faces obscured by the plain clothing they wore. They slipped between buildings, melted into the crowds of ordinary people, and moved with an eerie quiet that Kalen found unsettling. There were no loud orders, no sounds of heavy boots marching in unison. Just the soft shuffle of feet on the ground, the low hum of distant conversations. It felt as though they were becoming part of the very fabric of Earth itself. Hours passed. The soldiers had successfully completed their mission without any trace of their presence. They had gathered the intelligence they were sent to collect, and not a single soul in the settlement had suspected they were there. When the squad returned, Kalen's first words were simple, "Well done." But beneath his words of praise, something inside him stirred. Unease, perhaps, or even fear. The Empire had always relied on the certainty of its power, its ability to make its enemies fear it through sheer might. And now, the soldiers who had returned were not the warriors he was used to seeing, but something else entirely. People who had learned to be unseen, to move quietly, to blend into the world around them. The strength they had now was not in their weaponry, but in their ability to disappear, to exist in the shadows. Kalen couldn't help but wonder if the Empire's greatest strength had become its greatest weakness. For all their firepower, for all their might, they had overlooked something crucial, the power of invisibility. It was a concept that had once seemed laughable, even impossible, to someone like Kalen. But as he watched his soldiers, his once proud warriors, disappear into the night, he realized that this new way of war was more than just a tactic. It was a philosophy, one that changed everything about how the Empire would fight from now on. The next phase of their mission would bring them closer to Earth's heart, and Kalen knew that this time there would be no grand entrance. There would be no overwhelming show of force. This time, they would take a page out of Earth's playbook, and the battle that awaited them would be fought in silence, in secrecy, and in the shadows. Kalen stood at the edge of the cliff, gazing down at the sprawling metropolis below. The lights of the city flickered like stars in the night, a distant, almost serene reminder of the life that went on beneath them. For a moment, he allowed himself the rare indulgence of stillness. The air was thick with the weight of anticipation. He had come far from the officer he had been, the one who believed that strength was visible, that power lay in muscle and uniform, in the great machine of the empire. But now, the battle they had been preparing for was no longer about overwhelming force. It was about subtlety, about the quiet terror that came from being unseen, from being everywhere and nowhere at once. This was how Earth fought, and now, this was how the Empire would fight too. The night was their ally. It had been 2 months since the initial failure, and in that time, Kalen had overseen the transformation of his soldiers. The once proud Imperial Army, known for its power and intimidation, had shed its old skin. In its place were soldiers who moved like shadows, who blended into the cities and towns they infiltrated, whose very presence went unnoticed by the untrained eye. The difference was stark. The soldiers who had once been instruments of destruction were now quiet, calculating, like the very people they had once scorned as weak. Yet, despite the extensive training and preparation, something lingered within Kalen, an uncomfortable truth he hadn't fully embraced. Earth's soldiers didn't fight just with their physical prowess. They fought with something else, something deeper, something that even the Empire's finest were struggling to comprehend. The mission was simple: infiltrate, gather information, and leave without being detected. But simplicity didn't make it easy. The target was the heart of Earth's military operations, a facility nestled in the midst of a civilian population. It was a place that had remained hidden, cloaked in secrecy, and Kalen knew that to succeed here, they would need more than just tactical precision. They would need to understand how Earth soldiers thought, how they saw the world. As he descended into the briefing room, his soldiers gathered around him, faces shrouded in the dark hoods of their new, plain attire. There was a sense of quiet resolve in the air, but Kalen could see it in their eyes, the doubt, the uncertainty. They had been molded to become something different, but that didn't mean they had fully embraced the change. They were soldiers, after all. They had spent their lives relying on discipline and strength, not subtlety and restraint. Today, we face a test, Kalen said, his voice steady but laced with a quiet intensity. We're no longer the Empire's visible arm. We are its mind. We move in silence, we blend in, and we gather what we need. No one must know we are here. There was a murmur of agreement, but a few soldiers exchanged wary glances. Kalen had been their commander when they had marched in grand parades, when they had stormed into battle with flags flying and armor gleaming. They were not accustomed to this new mode of warfare, a kind of war fought not through might, but through intelligence and subterfuge. He understood their hesitation. He had felt it too, but there was no turning back now. The mission began. Their target was the facility, an underground complex situated beneath one of Earth's largest cities. It was protected by layers of security, designed to repel any force that could be seen or heard. But the soldiers who now followed Kalen had learned how to move like ghosts. They crept through the city under the cover of night, their movements fluid and deliberate. There were no large displays of force, no sudden bursts of gunfire. They did not storm the gates. They slipped in unnoticed, weaving through alleyways and blending into the crowds that moved in the dark. They reached the perimeter of the facility without incident, their presence masked by the sheer unremarkableness of their appearance. The soldiers who guarded the outer gates were no different from the civilians walking the streets, except that they wore uniforms. It was a perfect irony, one that Kalen had come to appreciate. In a world where everyone looked the same, no one knew who the true soldier was. Inside the facility, the soldiers moved quickly. They had no time to waste. Their task was to gather as much information as they could without alerting the enemy. But the deeper they ventured into the heart of the complex, the more unsettling the reality became. This wasn't just a military installation. It was a place of secrets, of operations hidden from the public eye. Kalen felt the weight of what they were doing, but there was no turning back. This was the future of war, and they had already crossed the threshold. It was then that the first crack appeared in their carefully constructed plan. As they navigated the facility's dark halls, one of the soldiers, a young officer named Jalen, froze. His eyes darted to a monitor that flickered briefly on the wall. On it was a live feed of the city, and in the distance, a small group of Earth soldiers was on the move, heading in their direction. For a moment, there was no sound. Kalen's heart raced. Had they been discovered? The realization was immediate. Earth had known how to fight this war from the beginning, and now the Empire was learning that it was not just the soldiers that were invisible. It was the very nature of the conflict that had made Earth so dangerous. Their enemies had learned how to adapt, how to blend in, how to hide their true strength. And now, Earth's soldiers were everywhere, moving in ways that the Empire couldn't possibly predict. "What do we do?" Jalen asked, his voice tight with anxiety. Kalen's mind raced. The lesson he had learned in the past months had prepared him for this, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. This was not just a matter of strength, nor of stealth. Earth had mastered something deeper, the art of moving without being noticed, of existing in plain sight while maintaining the upper hand. "We don't move," Kalen said, his voice quiet but firm. "We wait." The soldiers settled into place, blending with the shadows, becoming a part of the very walls themselves. They had come this far, and they would not falter now. As they waited in silence, Kalen's mind raced through the lessons they had learned, the strategies they had adapted to. But the realization hit him harder than any of the tactics they had been taught. Earth had not only mastered invisibility, they had perfected patience. In this kind of war, the waiting was as much a part of the battle as the fight itself. Time seemed to stretch on, the silence punctuated only by the quiet hum of the facility's power systems. The soldiers who had once been warriors of the Empire, trained to charge in a battle, now waited like hunters lying in wait for their prey. And Kalen knew that this was the true test. Not whether they could fight, but whether they could remain patient, remain hidden, and strike when the moment was right. It was a new kind of warfare, and the Empire was just beginning to understand it.